On this day, August 9th in 1961, freedom riders left LA for their destination in Houston, Texas, to protest the segregation of interstate transportation facilities. They momentarily desegregated a station in Houston. Their journey was documented by journalists, and today, citizen journalists record injustices happening across the country every day. I'm Dometi Pongo, and over the past few weeks, we've been drawing parallels between significant moments in history and what we see happening today. History can give us the context to better understand what we're living through today. I'm honored to have the opportunity to talk to one of our country's leading historians. I'm in conversation with Lonnie G, who is the first African-American secretary of the Smithsonian Institution and the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African-American History and Culture. Secretary, I want to talk about the role of media in documenting the history of struggle for social justice in this country. Let's begin first with the Freedom Riders. Media was so important in having the country understand what happened because there was a movie about it, documentaries came out about it. We had so much content because those Freedom Riders told the stories themselves. They documented their experience themselves. Why was it important for them to do that, and how did they have the foresight to know that that would be one of the keys to making sure that the country really knew what was happening?
One of the strengths of the civil rights movement was the recognition that visibility was the key, that you had to create a sense of moral suasion. You had to get Americans all over the country to know what was going on and to be able to sort of tap what the Freedom Riders thought was the inherent fairness of Americans. But in some ways, they're part of a long tradition. Going back to the 1827, Black newspapers have said, far too long others have spoken for us. And they realize that they have to be the place that tells stories that don't get into the mainstream media. And when the Freedom Riders are first attacked in different parts of the South, only then does the mainstream media begin to pay attention to this. The belief is that if an event is hidden, it hasn't happened. But if we can make sure it makes the front pages or makes the 6 o'clock evening news, then suddenly that beating, that death, really has a greater impact because it's no longer shrouded in silence, but it's boomed around the country based on the media. So that's why the media was so important to the civil rights movement and continues to be so important today as we look at the protests that are going on.
Objectivity is one of the pillars of journalism, but for so long, it had been misconstrued, in my opinion, to mean white neutrality. So that when you used certain words to describe Black pain, you then became labeled as a journal activist. I don't see myself as a journalist activist, as a journalist telling a story about what happened. And in the same way, if I'm talking about coronavirus, I'm not now a journal medical professional. How have you seen the industry evolve, not only in terms of how we tell these stories, but also the legitimacy that we give to different stories, and even the evolution of the notion of objectivity?
Well, I think that notion of objectivity shapes the way journalists do their work. But candidly, I remember early in my own career, I would talk about my passion to explore African-American history, and they'd say, oh, you're not objective enough. And that meant, in my mind, being objective meant don't say anything that's going to embarrass us. Don't say anything that's going to make us look bad. Don't say anything that's going to challenge us. And so what you see, I think, in journalism is the recognition that, first of all, it's personal. So therefore, you tell these stories in a way that make the incident human. And that, in essence, you begin to realize that by the choices you make, you're being political anyway. So make more explicit choices about how your work as a journalist should really help a country confront the challenge of the civil rights movement. I think what you see is journalists have a strong code of what is ethically correct, but they recognize that part of what they do is have to tell a story that has meaning, have to tell a story that can lead to transformative change.
Telling stories that lead to transformative change can put you in the crosshairs. And there's a long history of journalists, even today, and not just in America, being targeted because of the stories they choose to tell. We saw live on television Omar Jimenez at CNN arrested as he was covering a protest march. It's a pretty mild example compared to what journalists may have experienced in history. Can you provide context to how journalists have put their lives on the line to tell some of these stories and how the country has evolved in our relationship to journalists?
Journalists are always at risk because the first casualty, not just of war, but of demonstrations, is truth. And it's the journalist's job to make sure the truth be told. And so that means that sometimes journalists, sometimes their editors, don't want to shed the light in this area. They're worried about a corporate backlash or a political backlash. And there's always that tension between what will hurt the media versus what will help a movement. And so I find it very powerful that journalists have been arrested, and I think that tells you the importance of free speech. It tells you the power of illuminating the dark corners of an experience, and it tells you how risky it is to speak truth to power, but how important it is.
I think journalists have so much power today because Twitter has allowed the everyday person to become a journalist, for better and sometimes for worse. Can you talk about how the role of the gatekeeper has changed? Because if anyone tweeted it, it happened. How has that shaped how we look at media and these stories?
I think that what it means is it's a dual-edged sword, right? On the one hand, it means that the information is not being filtered by the three big networks or not being filtered by a kind of entity that's ultimately owned by a corporation. But on the other hand, it also makes it harder to understand what's true, to understand what's a real point of view versus what is a news story. So I think that I love the fact that without the cameras on a phone, we wouldn't have seen about George Floyd. Without the cameras on the phone, there's so much that we would miss. What I just want to make sure is that we also have people understand what they're seeing and have someone who is trained to help interpret what they're seeing.
As we talk about different kinds of media, even out of the journalism space, thinking about the arts, I think one of the most powerful things about the documentation of the Black experience throughout history and archived and curated so beautifully at the Smithsonian is that we see representations of ourselves and our ancestors. You know, I remember vividly, there's this one picture of Madam C.J. Walker in her car with her friends, balling out.
With that hat.
With the hat. And I'm like, yo, Madam C.J. Walker and Meg the Stallion are part parcel of the same person, you know? And can we talk a bit about the power in just Black joy and positive representation in media, in our gaudy greatness, in the Harlem Renaissance, that flashiness that relates to how we manifest our swag today in pop culture?
Well, I've always argued that there's a great quote from George Wolfe, you know, that basically said, God invented Black people and Black people invented style. And so, in a way, what you see is through all this representation, the struggle to capture our style, the struggle to counter the prevailing images of stereotypical Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben shuffling people. And so what you see historically is a fight to say, how do I show our true selves? Whether it is the amazing art of Richmond Barthé or Augusta Savage during the Harlem Renaissance, or whether it is the way that Lorraine Hansberry tried to capture what it was like in Chicago in a period of trying to desegregate what then was the South Side. And that for me, what you see through the artists, through the media, is they not only capture our true self, but they capture our truer intentions. Here's what we wanted to do. Here's what we wanted to say. Here's what we wanted to be that we couldn't be, but your eye captures that. Your eye helps me remember that as a people, we've struggled, but we've also smiled. As a people, we've had loss, but boy, we've also danced. As a people, we have found separation hard, but we also love our families.
That's powerful.